The restaurant fell silent as Jasmine's fingers danced across the ivory keys of the grand piano. Looking back, Alexander Reed never imagined a 12-year-old black girl would save his daughter's life that night. He also never imagined he'd lose his billion-dollar empire because of it. Before we dive into this life-changing encounter, where are you watching from today? Take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to join our storytelling community. Now let me take you back to that fateful night at the Golden Palace, where a single cry would change everything. Alexander Reed, 39-year-old tech magnate and real estate developer, pushed through the gleaming brass doors of the Golden Palace, with his 6-month-old daughter Sophia wailing in his arms. The maitre d' recognized him instantly, his practiced smile faltering as Sophia's piercing cries echoed through the marble-floored entrance. "Mr. Reed, your usual table is ready, but perhaps tonight." Alexander cut him off with a cold stare. "The meeting proceeds as planned." He had no choice but to bring Sophia tonight, after his nanny had called in sick at the last minute, leaving him scrambling for a solution. The Yamamoto Group executives were flying back to Tokyo tomorrow morning, and rescheduling wasn't an option if he wanted to secure their $100 million investment in his newest development project. As Alexander navigated through the dimly lit restaurant, the sound of clinking crystal and soft murmurs gave way to uncomfortable silence as diners turned to identify the source of the disturbance. Sophia's face was flushed, her tiny fists balled up against her onesie, as she continued her relentless crying, despite Alexander's gentle bouncing and whispered reassurances. Maurice, the restaurant manager, appeared at his side, bowing slightly but with tension evident in his jaw. "Mr. Reed, while we always value your patronage, perhaps tonight is not ideal. Our atmosphere standards." Alexander's response was immediate and cutting. "I own 30% of your parent company, Maurice. The table stays. The meeting proceeds." The manager retreated with a tight nod, but the damage was done. Other patrons were now openly staring, some with sympathy, most with annoyance. Alexander adjusted his custom-tailored Brioni suit, aware of his visible wealth, the Patek Philippe watch, worth more than what most of the staff earned. In a year, the Italian leather shoes, the subtle signals of power that usually insulated him from inconveniences that plagued ordinary people. His bodyguard waited discreetly outside the hostess, had practically bowed when he entered, and yet here he was as helpless as any new parent against the unrelenting cries of an infant. Since Claire's death during childbirth 6 months ago, Alexander had plunged himself deeper into work, earning his nickname, the Demolisher, for his ruthless acquisition and dismantling of struggling companies. His current project, the acquisition and revitalization of the historically black neighborhood of Riverside, was his most ambitious yet promising to transform underutilized urban space into luxury condominiums and upscale retail. What the glossy prospectus didn't mention was the displacement of hundreds of families who had lived there for generations. Across the room, Desiree Wilson, 34, weaved between tables, with practiced efficiency balancing 3 plates of exquisitely arranged cuisine that cost more than her daily wages. Her worn but meticulously polished shoes pinched her feet as she completed her 10th hour of a double shift. Desiree noticed the commotion around the Billionaire's table but hesitated to approach. Previous experiences with wealthy white patrons had taught her painful lessons about assumptions and boundaries, lessons that still stung. The Golden Palace's interior screamed exclusivity: hand-painted murals, crystal chandeliers, real gold leaf accents on the crown molding, all designed to communicate that this space wasn't for everyone. It certainly wasn't designed for someone like Desiree, who was working double shifts to make rent on the Riverside apartment where she'd lived for the past decade, now threatened with eviction notices as Reed Enterprises bought up the entire block. In the staff break room, Desiree's 12-year-old daughter Jasmine sat quietly completing her homework occasionally, glancing at the second-hand laptop open beside her textbooks. Despite the challenges, Jasmine had secured a partial scholarship to Westfield Arts Academy, where her extraordinary musical talent had caught the attention of instructors even as she navigated the subtle and not-so-subtle racism from classmates and their parents. Sophia's cries intensified, reaching a pitch that made conversation at nearby tables impossible. Alexander tried everything, her bottle rocking her gently, offering her pacifier, but nothing seemed to soothe her. He could see the Japanese investors entering the restaurant, now being greeted by the maitre d'. Restaurant staff whispered among themselves near the service station, a few casting glances and placing bets on how long before the billionaire would be forced to leave. Desiree overheard Brad, one of the other servers, mutter to the bartender, "These people think they can bring anything in here. Just because he's rich doesn't mean we need to hear his kids screaming all night." She noticed he didn't use the same tone when the senator's grandchildren had caused a similar disruption last week. Desiree pressed her lips together and continued preparing her tables, all too familiar with the double standards at play in spaces like this, where belonging wasn't just about money, but about who you were and what you looked like. Trevor Phillips, Alexander's chief financial officer and longtime business associate, arrived at the table just as Sophia's cries reached a new crescendo. His expression cycled rapidly from confusion to embarrassment to thinly veiled annoyance as he set his leather portfolio on the table and leaned toward Alexander. "We could postpone," he suggested in a low voice. "The Yamamotos would understand a family emergency." Alexander shook his head, firmly adjusting Sophia in his arms. "This deal closes tonight. 6 months of work, Trevor. I'm not rescheduling because of a fussy baby." His stubbornness was legendary in business circles, the same unyielding determination that had built Reed Enterprises from a small real estate firm into a billion-dollar conglomerate. Across the dining room, Desiree watched the scene unfolding, noting the increasing tension in the billionaire's shoulders, the desperate way he tried to quiet his daughter. Despite Maurice catching her eye and subtly shaking his head in warning, Desiree made a decision and approached the table. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice professional but warm. "I couldn't help noticing your daughter seems uncomfortable. I have a 12-year-old myself, and I've worked with many babies. Would you like some help?" Alexander looked up, his initial expression, one of surprise, quickly shifting to suspicion, then dismissal. "We're fine," he replied curtly, barely making eye contact. "I've got it under control." Trevor shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Alexander and Desiree. "You know how they are with kids," he muttered to Alexander, just loud enough for Desiree to hear. "Natural instinct and all that." The casual racism wasn't new to Desiree, but it still stung, especially when delivered with a smile that suggested Trevor thought he was paying her a compliment. Sophia's wailing intensified just as the group of Japanese executives was being led through the restaurant toward their table. Her tiny face had turned an alarming shade of red, her cries now taking on a strange, gasping quality. The restaurant manager approached again, this time his professional veneer cracking. "Mr. Reed, I must insist." Alexander cut him off with a glare, but Maurice wasn't finished. He turned to Desiree instead. "Wilson, you're needed at tables 7 and 12. Stop bothering our valued guests immediately." The reprimand was delivered with a sharpness reserved for staff of Desiree's position and color. Alexander had witnessed enough service industry interactions to recognize the difference between how Maurice spoke to the white sommelier versus the black waitstaff. A memory flashed through Desiree's mind, her previous position at the Harbinger, another upscale restaurant where she'd been passed over for promotion 3 times, despite having seniority each time in favor of less experienced white colleagues. The manager there had used the same tone, the same dismissive flick of the wrist when she'd questioned the decision. Alexander's desperation grew as Sophia's cries escalated and the Yamamoto executives approached. The meeting he'd spent months orchestrating was about to implode before it even began. He noticed something concerning. Sophia's breathing seemed labored between screams, and the redness in her face had spread down her neck. Desiree, still hovering nearby despite the manager's dismissal, spoke again. "Sir, I don't want to overstep, but your daughter's showing signs that might indicate something more than just fussiness." That rash spreading on her neck, Alexander cut her off. "She's fine. She's just overtired. I don't need parenting advice from a waitress trying to get an extra tip." Desiree flinched slightly at his words, but stood her ground. "Sir, I'm also a nursing student. and around them the atmosphere had grown increasingly hostile. A man at the adjacent table loudly complained. "Some places should simply ban children. We're paying for ambiance, not a nursery." A woman at another table nodded in agreement, adding, "Ba Tom. Or at least certain parents should know better." Alexander's phone vibrated in his pocket. He awkwardly shifted Sophia to check the screen. His project manager for the Riverside development with an urgent update. A local community organization had managed to get media coverage of the evictions, with several families telling emotional stories of being forced from homes they'd lived in for generations. The timing couldn't be worse. Any negative publicity could spook the Yamamoto group. Desiree caught fragments of his hushed phone conversation, recognizing the name of her own neighborhood. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This man holding the crying baby was Alexander Reed, the developer behind Reed Enterprises, the company that had issued the eviction notice she'd found taped to her door last week. Her hands trembled slightly as she refilled water glasses at a nearby table. The same man threatening her family's home was sitting here inconvenienced by his crying child while making business deals that would displace hundreds. Maurice appeared at her side again, his voice low and threatening. "One more time straying from your section to bother Mr. Reed, and you're terminated. We have a dozen people who would take your position tomorrow." Desiree nodded silently, the weight of her precarious situation pressing down on her shoulders. Her daughter's school tuition was already stretching her budget to the breaking point, and without this job they'd have no income while she finished her nursing degree. Yet something about the baby's symptoms alarmed her professional instincts. She found herself torn between self-preservation and genuine concern for a child who might be experiencing something serious, a child whose father happened to be the very man threatening to demolish everything she'd worked. 4. Inside the staff break room, Jasmine Wilson closed her history textbook and stretched her arms above her head. She'd been sitting in the same position for nearly 3 hours, attempting to finish her essay on the civil rights movement while her mother completed her shift. The monotonous hum of the refrigerator was interrupted by the sound of raised voices coming from the dining room, unusual for the typically subdued atmosphere of the Golden Palace. Curiosity getting the better of her, Jasmine carefully opened the break room door and peered into the hallway. Several kitchen staff rushed past, whispering about the commotion in the main dining area. Despite strict rules against staff children entering the restaurant floor, Jasmine slipped out and followed the sound of a baby's distressed cries. Positioning herself behind a decorative column, she observed the scene: a well-dressed white man struggling with a screaming infant, her mother hovering nearby with a concerned expression, and the restaurant manager gesturing angrily. Jasmine noticed something about the crying baby that the adults seemed to be missing. The infant's face wasn't just red from crying. There was an uneven, blotchy pattern extending down her neck and onto her chest, where the collar of her dress had slipped aside. Drawing on her extensive knowledge from living with severe allergies her entire life, Jasmine recognized the signs of an allergic reaction. Without considering the consequences, Jasmine stepped out from behind the column and walked directly toward the table, ignoring her mother's wide-eyed look of horror and frantic gesture to retreat. A security guard stationed near the entrance immediately changed direction, moving to intercept her as though a 12-year-old black girl in a simple t-shirt and jeans was somehow a threat in this environment of crystal and silk. Alexander Reed looked up from his crying daughter to see a young black girl approaching his table uninvited. His first reaction was irritation bordering on anger. This night was already disastrous enough without random children wandering through the restaurant. "Your baby isn't just crying," Jasmine said, her voice clear and direct despite the security guard now gripping her shoulder. "She's having an allergic reaction. My cousin had the same rash pattern and trouble breathing before we found out he was allergic to milk protein." Alexander's expression froze somewhere between dismissal and desperate hope. The child seemed oddly composed, looking directly at his daughter with analytical focus rather than at him or the luxury surroundings. Before he could respond, the restaurant manager appeared, his face flushed with anger. "This is completely unacceptable," Maurice hissed, reaching for Jasmine's arm. "Security will escort you out immediately." We do not allow children to harass our patrons. Desiree rushed forward, placing herself between Maurice and her daughter. "Don't you dare put your hands on my child," she said, her voice quiet but steel-edged. "She's trying to help." Alexander found himself studying Jasmine's expression. There was no agenda there, no angle being played, just genuine concern. It contrasted sharply with the contempt and judgment he'd been receiving from others in the restaurant. Meanwhile, Sophia's cries had taken on a wheezing quality, and the rash Jasmine had pointed out was now unmistakably spreading. "What did you say about allergic reactions?" Alexander asked, addressing Jasmine directly for the first time. Jasmine stepped closer, ignoring Maurice's glare. "Is she having trouble breathing? Has she started any new foods recently? The rash pattern looks like a milk protein allergy, but it could be something else." Alexander nodded reluctantly. "My assistant switched her formula yesterday. Some organic brand." Jasmine held out her hand. "Can I see the ingredients list? If it's what I think it is, you need to act quickly. Her airway could be compromising." The security guard looked to Maurice for direction, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sir, should I remove them?" Alexander made a split-second decision. "No. Let her speak." He fumbled in the diaper bag and produced a container of formula. Jasmine scanned the ingredients and pointed to one immediately. "There. Whey protein. If she's allergic to milk proteins, this could cause anaphylaxis." As if confirming her diagnosis, Sophia's breathing became audibly labored. "You need to call an ambulance," Jasmine instructed. "And do you have an EpiPen? Children with known allergies usually carry one." Alexander shook his head, panic finally breaking through his composed exterior. "She doesn't have diagnosed allergies. This is the first time." "Call 911 now," Jasmine said firmly. "Tell them suspected anaphylaxis in an infant. Until they arrive, you need to keep her upright to help her breathing, and watch for any blue tint to her lips or fingernails." Her instructions contradicted Alexander's instinct to lay the baby down and check her breathing more closely. The confidence in Jasmine's voice made him hesitate. "How do you know all this?" Jasmine pulled up her sleeve to reveal a medical alert bracelet. "I have severe allergies. I've been in anaphylactic shock 4 times. The first time, no one recognized the symptoms until it was almost too late." Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone from a completely different world suddenly becomes your lifeline? Type number 1 in the comments if you've ever had your assumptions about someone completely shattered like Alexander's were in this moment. Can you imagine the emotions rushing through him? A billionaire being educated by a 12-year-old black girl from the very neighborhood he was planning to demolish. Hit the like button if you're invested in what happens. Next. Now, as paramedics race toward the Golden Palace, what will Alexander discover about the mother-daughter duo that might forever change his perspective on the community he's been so eager to transform? Alexander followed Jasmine's instructions, despite his instinctive resistance to taking direction from a child. He kept Sophia upright, supporting her tiny body while monitoring her labored breathing. The restaurant's ambient noise had diminished to hushed whispers as patrons and staff watched the drama unfold. Within minutes, Sophia's breathing seemed less strained, though the angry red rash continued to spread across her skin. Maurice hovered nearby, his professional demeanor cracking under the strain of the unprecedented situation. "Mr. Reed, I've taken the liberty of arranging a private area while we wait for medical assistance. And these individuals can return to their appropriate places." The way he emphasized individuals while glancing dismissively at Desiree and Jasmine revealed volumes about his perspective. Alexander found himself noticing the microaggressions he might have overlooked before. The security guard who maintained a hand near his weapon while standing near Jasmine. The wide berth other patrons gave Desiree despite crowding around him with offers of help and unsolicited advice. "They stay with me," Alexander said, firmly surprising himself with the declaration. Sophia had finally stopped crying, her exhaustion evident as she wheezed softly against his shoulder. The wail of sirens announced the paramedics' arrival, and within moments, emergency medical technicians burst through the restaurant's entrance, equipment in hand. The first responders immediately moved toward Alexander and Sophia, their training evident in their efficient assessment of the situation. Suspected allergic reaction in a 6-month-old, the lead paramedic announced reaching for the baby. One of them turned to Alexander. What happened? Before Alexander could respond, Jasmine spoke up. Probable milk protein allergy reaction to new formula. Symptoms progressed from hives to respiratory distress over approximately 20 minutes. No known previous allergic history. The paramedic barely glanced at Jasmine, directing his questions to Alexander instead. "Is that accurate, sir?" Something protective and unfamiliar stirred in Alexander. "Yes, and you should listen to her." She recognized the symptoms when no one else did. The paramedics efficiently attached monitoring equipment to Sophia, confirming what Jasmine had already identified. "Good catch," the female paramedic acknowledged, finally looking directly at Jasmine. "You potentially saved this baby from a much more serious outcome. Pediatric anaphylaxis can escalate extremely quickly." Alexander felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and discomfort as he watched the medical team work on his daughter. The reality that a child he would have dismissed had potentially saved Sophia's life created a cognitive dissonance he couldn't immediately resolve. Through the restaurant's windows, he noticed the telltale flashing of cameras. Somehow word had spread that billionaire Alexander Reed was involved in a medical emergency at the Golden Palace. The vultures had already gathered, sensing a story worth selling. Desiree noticed the media attention too, and instinctively moved to shield Jasmine from view, positioning herself between her daughter and the windows. "We don't need that kind of visibility," she murmured more to herself than anyone else. Alexander caught the comment and the fear behind it, a fear he'd never had to consider. The paramedics prepared to transport Sophia to the hospital for further observation and treatment. As they began to move toward the exit, Alexander turned to Desiree and Jasmine. "I owe you both a significant debt. Please let me compensate you for your help." He reached for his wallet, but Desiree shook her head firmly. "We don't need your money, Mr. Reed." There was dignity in her refusal that made Alexander uncomfortable in ways he couldn't immediately identify. "She needs medical attention that's payment enough," Desiree added, nodding toward Sophia. "Actually," Jasmine interjected, "surprising both adults, I play piano. That's all." The non sequitur hung in the air as restaurant staff began ushering other patrons back to their tables, attempting to restore normalcy. The Yamamoto Group executives had been discreetly seated at a distant table, watching the commotion with inscrutable expressions. Alexander made a mental note to have his assistant arrange alternate transportation for them back to their hotel. As he prepared to follow the paramedics, Alexander learned that Jasmine had recognized Sophia's symptoms not just from textbook knowledge, but from painful personal experience. "I've had severe allergies since I was 3, Jasmine explained quietly. "The last reaction put me in the hospital for 4 days. Desiree's expression tightened. 4 days we couldn't really afford with our insurance situation. Maurice chose that moment to approach his face a mask of forced professional concern. "Mr. Reed, please be assured that this unfortunate incident will be addressed. Miss Wilson knows that bringing a child into the dining area violates our policies. Her employment is of course terminated, effective immediately." The cold dismissal hit Alexander like a splash of ice water, yet he found himself momentarily paralyzed by indecision. This woman's daughter had just saved his child, yet his ingrained response was to stay out of staff issues. He watched as Desiree's face registered the news. Not surprise, but a resigned dignity that spoke of having weathered similar injustices before. "I understand," she said, simply gathering her small purse from a nearby service station. "Jasmine, get your backpack from the break room." The Yamamoto executives observed the entire exchange with interest, their expressions unreadable as they whispered among themselves. The paramedics signaled they were ready to depart, and Alexander found himself torn between following his daughter and addressing the situation with Desiree and Jasmine. "Mr. Reed, we need to leave now," the lead paramedic urged. The decision was made for him. "Jasmine plays the piano," he repeated absently, trying to connect the random comment to anything relevant. As Desiree and Jasmine were escorted toward the staff exit, Jasmine looked back once. "I hope she feels better soon," she called her voice, carrying clearly across the now quiet restaurant. Alexander stood in the center of the opulent dining room, his daughter's health stabilized, but his mind in turmoil. The contrast was jarring. Crystal chandeliers overhead, hand-knotted Persian rugs underfoot sommeliers, hovering with $1,000 bottles of wine, and the memory of Desiree's worn shoes, Jasmine's second-hand backpack. Their quiet dignity, in the face of injustice he had witnessed but failed to address. For the first time in years, the luxury surrounding him felt hollow. The meeting with the Yamamoto group proceeded mechanically, with Alexander going through practiced motions, while his mind remained fixated on Sophia now being treated at Boston Children's Hospital. His assistant had arranged for his personal physician to oversee her care, ensuring the best possible treatment. While nodding at appropriate intervals during the investor's presentation, Alexander discreetly researched infant milk protein allergies on his phone beneath the table. Everything Jasmine had identified, the rash pattern, the respiratory distress, the rapid onset, aligned perfectly with the medical descriptions. Had she not intervened, the articles warned Sophia might have experienced full anaphylactic shock with potentially devastating consequences. The realization triggered a memory. Alexander had worked hard to suppress Claire's death during childbirth. The sudden decline in her condition that the doctors hadn't caught in time, his helplessness as alarms blared and medical staff rushed to intervene. Too late, just as it might have been too late for Sophia without Jasmine's intervention. The meeting concluded with tentative agreements rather than the firm commitments Alexander had hoped for. The Yamamoto representatives cited concerns about local resistance to the Riverside development. News of the community protests had reached them despite Alexander's team's efforts at containment. As he gathered his papers, Trevor leaned close. "Don't worry about it. We'll counter the bleeding heart narrative with economic impact projections. These people always follow the money. These people—" The phrase echoed uncomfortably in Alexander's mind, recalling Trevor's earlier comment about Desiree. Outside the restaurant, the spring night had turned surprisingly cold, a light rain beginning to fall. As his driver brought the Bentley around, Alexander spotted two figures at the nearby bus stop. Desiree and Jasmine huddled together under a small umbrella waiting in the rain, while wealthy patrons were ushered into luxury vehicles all around them. Something impulsive and unfamiliar propelled Alexander forward. "Mrs. Wilson," he called, approaching them. Miss Desiree corrected automatically, her expression guarded. "Would you allow me to offer you a ride home? It's the least I can do, considering what Jasmine did for Sophia." Desiree hesitated, years of learned caution warring with practical considerations. The next bus wouldn't arrive for 45 minutes, and the rain was getting heavier. "We live in Riverside," she said finally. "It's not on your way." Alexander opened the car door in response. "Please, I insist." The tension inside the Bentley was palpable as they pulled away from the restaurant. Jasmine sat perfectly still, her backpack clutched on her lap, eyes wide as she took in the vehicle's luxurious interior without comment. Desiree sat rigidly, as far from Alexander as the seat allowed. "How is your daughter?" she finally asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Stabilized. They're keeping her overnight for observation. My housekeeper is with her now." The clinical update felt inadequate, failing to express the churning emotions beneath, fear, relief, and a gnawing sense of obligation to the people sitting across from him. As the Bentley glided from downtown Boston toward Riverside, the transition between neighborhoods was stark. Glass and steel skyscrapers gave way to older brick buildings, manicured parks replaced by vacant lots, boutique storefronts, yielding to check-cashing businesses, and convenience stores with barred windows. Alexander found himself seeing the progression through new eyes, not as underutilized real estate opportunities, but as the physical manifestation of systemic inequity. Outside a corner store, a police cruiser had stopped two young black men, ordering them to place their hands against the wall while officers conducted a search. Desiree stiffened beside him but said nothing. Alexander noticed his driver Richards locking the doors as they turned onto a street lined with triple-decker homes, many showing signs of deferred maintenance. The man's discomfort was evident in his rear-view mirror glances and tightened grip on the steering wheel. "You can drop us at the corner of Maple and Washington," Desiree said clearly, noting the driver's unease. "No, please, your exact address," Alexander insisted. "It's late and the rain is getting worse." Reluctantly, Desiree directed them to a brick apartment building with security bars on the first-floor windows and a front door missing its security glass. As they pulled up, Alexander felt a jolt of recognition. The building was owned by West Side Properties, a subsidiary he'd acquired last year as part of the Riverside development package. In effect, he was Desiree's landlord. Alexander stepped out of the car despite Richard's concerned expression, insisting on walking them to the door. The building's exterior lights were non-functional, the entryway dimly illuminated by a single bulb inside. The lock on the security door was clearly broken, hanging loosely from its mounting. The management company said they'd fixed that 3 months ago. Desiree commented, noticing Alexander's attention to the damaged lock. "After Mrs. Everton on the first floor was robbed. Same with the hallway lights and the elevator that hasn't worked since Christmas. Inside, the situation was no better." The lobby held the unmistakable smell of mildew from water damage, and makeshift mailboxes had been jury-rigged to replace the original ones that appeared to have been vandalized. An elderly black woman emerged from the first-floor apartment, struggling with a walker. Evening Desiree, she called her voice warm, despite her apparent physical discomfort. "This, the landlord finally come to fix the heat. Been telling them the radiator's not working right for weeks." Alexander felt the weight of her mistaken identification. "No, Mrs. Taylor, just a colleague giving us a ride." Desiree explained carefully, "This is Mr. Reed." The elderly woman squinted at Alexander. "Reed. Like them notices they've been putting up. Telling us we got to be out by summer." Alexander nodded uncomfortably. "I'm affiliated with Reed Enterprises, yes, Mrs." Taylor's expression hardened. "Affiliated. That's a fancy way of saying you're the one putting us out, isn't it? Lived here 47 years, raised my children and grandchildren in this building. Where exactly are folks like us supposed to go?" She didn't wait for an answer, making her slow way toward the mailboxes. As they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, Alexander noticed the community bulletin board covered with flyers, neighborhood watch schedules, free health clinic announcements, a community garden sign-up sheet, and information about mutual aid networks providing childcare and meal assistance. The evidence of strong community bonds despite challenging physical conditions contradicted the blighted urban area designation his development team had used in their reports. Desiree unlocked 3 separate locks on her apartment door. Inside, the contrast with the building's common areas was striking. The small apartment was immaculately maintained, with well-worn but clean furniture walls painted in cheerful colors and bookshelves overflowing with volumes. Alexander's eyes were immediately drawn to Jasmine's room, visible through an open door. The walls covered with framed music certificates, academic achievement awards, and scholarship announcements. "You play at competitions?" Alexander asked, noting a recent certificate from the Boston Youth Symphony Orchestra. Jasmine nodded, suddenly animated. "And at church on Sundays. Mr. Mater's Toplick WWW. Williams lets me practice on their piano during the week, since we can't fit one here." She gestured toward a small electronic keyboard in the corner of the living room. "I'm saving up for a better one, but..." She trailed off, the unspoken financial reality hanging between them. Before leaving, Alexander heard the sound of Jasmine playing the keyboard, the limitations of the instrument unable to mask the extraordinary talent in her fingering and interpretation. Even through the tinny electronic sound, he recognized elements of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, played with a depth of feeling that seemed impossible from a 12-year-old. The melody followed him back to his silent, spacious penthouse overlooking the Boston harbor. The emptiness of his home struck him with unexpected force. No photographs on walls, no personal mementos, just expensive furnishings selected by an interior designer and changed seasonally to reflect current trends. The contrast with Desiree's humble but personal space left him unsettled, standing alone in his marble-floored entryway, while Sophia remained under hospital observation. Alexander canceled all meetings the following morning, instructing his assistant to clear his calendar indefinitely as he headed to Boston Children's Hospital. The specialist confirmed what Jasmine had identified. Sophia had a severe milk protein allergy that had triggered anaphylaxis. She's lucky Dr. Abramson emphasized reviewing Sophia's charts. If the reaction hadn't been identified quickly, we could be having a very different conversation. Whoever recognized the symptoms potentially saved her life. Back in his office later that afternoon, Alexander found a comprehensive file on his desk. His assistant had taken the initiative to research Desiree and Jasmine Wilson after he'd mentioned their names that morning. The dossier revealed details that left Alexander increasingly unsettled. Jasmine wasn't merely talented. She was considered a musical prodigy by several prominent instructors. Notes from her elementary school music teacher described her as once-in-a-generation talent, yet her applications to several prestigious training programs had been rejected despite stellar auditions. One private note obtained through Alexander's connections revealed the actual reason for a recent rejection from the Waldorf Conservatory. While extremely talented doesn't reflect the image and background of our typical student, concerns about cultural fit and families' ability to participate appropriately in school community. The thinly veiled discrimination was unmistakable. Another section of the file detailed Desiree's community activities. She served as secretary for the Riverside Preservation Committee, the very organization leading resistance against his development project. Her name appeared on petitions at city council meetings and in coordinating community response to the eviction notices Reed Enterprises had issued. The cognitive dissonance intensified. This woman, whose daughter had saved Sophia, was fighting to preserve the very neighborhood he planned to demolish. That afternoon, Alexander made an unannounced visit to the Waldorf Conservatory, using his substantial donor status to secure an immediate meeting with the director, Margaret Whitman. The exclusive music academy occupied a renovated Beacon Hill mansion, its practice rooms filled with students who were predominantly white and visibly affluent. "We maintain the highest standards," Whitman explained, defensively after Alexander questioned their rejection of Jasmine. "Our admissions process considers many factors beyond raw talent." Alexander pressed further, such as the director shifted uncomfortably. Family commitment to musical education, ability to provide appropriate instruments for home practice, participation in fundraising events, tradition of musical appreciation, a holistic picture. Each requirement thinly masked the actual barriers: wealth connections and race. "A student was rejected from your piano program last month," Alexander continued. 12 years old, black from Riverside. Exceptional talent noted by your own evaluators. Whitman's expression tightened. "I don't recall the specific application, but if our committee declined, there must have been sound reasons." Alexander placed Jasmine's file on the desk between them. "I'd like those reasons documented and sent to my office by tomorrow morning." Back at Reed Enterprises headquarters, Alexander immersed himself in research that his team had previously handled: the historical patterns of housing discrimination in Boston, the specific history of Riverside and his own company's practices. What he discovered left him profoundly disturbed. Maps from the 1,930 seconds showed Riverside clearly outlined in red, literally redlined, designating it as hazardous for mortgage, lending a practice that had systematically denied black residents access to home ownership and wealth, building for generations. More disturbing were his company's modern equivalents of these practices: targeted predatory lending through financial partners, systematic undervaluation of properties when purchased from black owners, and overvaluation when selling to developers like himself. During an emergency board meeting called to address the Riverside situation, several members warned about potential legal exposure if the company acknowledged past discriminatory practices. "We operate within current legal frameworks," the company's general counsel insisted. "Historical context is irrelevant to our current operations." Trevor was more blunt. "Look, the Riverside project is projected to deliver a 38% return on investment. The displacement concerns are unfortunate but necessary for urban renewal. We can include some affordable housing units if it helps with the PR angle, but scaling back significantly would breach our fiduciary duty to shareholders." That evening, Alexander found himself parked outside the Riverside Community Center, watching residents gather for what his intelligence had identified as an emergency meeting about the Reed Enterprises development. Against his security team's advice, he entered alone, taking a seat in the back row. The room was filled with families of various ages, predominantly Black and Latino residents, many still in work uniforms, nursing scrubs, maintenance coveralls, retail name tags, having come directly from jobs. Alexander remained anonymous. Just another face in the crowded room as community leaders outlined the threat posed by the development and potential resistance strategies. Then Desiree Wilson took the stage. Alexander was struck by her transformation from the reserved waitress he'd met to this commanding presence. Riverside isn't just buildings and streets, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. It's generations of families who've built lives here despite redlining, despite municipal neglect, despite being told we don't belong. This community raised me when my mother fell ill. This community protected my daughter when I worked night shifts. This community deserves to determine its own future, not have it decided in some corporate boardroom by people who've never walked our streets or shared our struggles. The room erupted in applause and affirmations. Desiree continued outlining the legal challenges. They were mounting the media attention, they were garnering, and the community cohesion that would be their greatest strength. Following her presentation, Jasmine was invited to perform. She took her place at an old upright piano that had seen better days, its wood finish worn around the keys from years of use. Despite the instrument's limitations, when Jasmine began to play, Alexander felt a physical reaction. The melody was hauntingly familiar, a piece Claire had often played during their early years together. The composition captured something essential about Riverside itself: resilience within constraints, beauty emerging from struggle. The familiar notes transported Alexander back to his earliest memories of Claire before wealth and status had insulated them from the world's harsher realities. A local community elder was speaking about the historical significance of Riverside when someone recognized Alexander. "That's Reed himself." A voice called out, and heads turned in his direction. The room temperature seemed to drop instantly as recognition spread. "What are you doing here?" someone demanded. Gathering intelligence on us, Desiree looked as shocked as anyone to see him, but recovered quickly. "Mr. Reed has as much right to attend a public meeting as anyone," she stated firmly, though her expression remained guarded. "If he's here to listen, that's more than his company has done so far." The hostility was palpable, as Alexander made his way to the front of the room, aware of the risk he was taking but compelled by something stronger than business instinct. "You're right," he acknowledged, addressing the room but looking at Desiree. "We haven't listened. I haven't listened." A middle-aged man stood up. "We don't need your confession. We need you to stop the evictions. Some of us have been here for generations." Alexander noticed a presentation board nearby, showing an alternative development plan created by residents working with a local architect. Unlike his company's vision, this plan preserved most existing housing, while strategically renovating certain structures, adding community amenities, and incorporating affordable business incubation spaces. "I'd like to see your proposal," Alexander said, gesturing toward the boards. A community organizer named Marcus stepped forward suspiciously. "Why? So you can tell us all the reasons it won't work. Did that conversation remind you of moments when different worlds collide unexpectedly? Comment number 1. If you've ever been in a situation where you had to confront your own biases or assumptions, would you have had the courage to walk into that community meeting like Alexander did? Hit that like button if you're on the edge of your seat, wondering what happens next. As Alexander leaves the community center with their alternative proposal in hand, what unimaginable discovery will he make about his own family's connection to Riverside, and will Jasmine's extraordinary talent be enough to bridge the divide between these two worlds that seemed destined for conflict? The leather-bound journal felt unnaturally heavy in Alexander's hands as he sat in his father's former office, now a rarely used space in the Reed family estate outside Boston. Following the community meeting, something had compelled him to revisit his father's private papers, records his father, Richard Reed, had explicitly instructed should be destroyed after his death. an instruction Alexander had never fully carried out. The journal's yellowing pages documented business decisions from the early days of Reed Enterprises, including specific strategies for acquiring properties in Riverside during the 1980 seconds. Approach through intermediaries, only one entry read. Direct contact will alert residents to coordinated purchase efforts and drive up prices. Thompson suggests using tax liens and code violations to pressure holdouts. Another entry was even more explicit, City Inspector Williamson proving invaluable. His selective enforcement of code violations against targeted properties is creating desired selling pressure. Additional compensation arranged through offshore consultancy. The systematic destruction of Riverside's economic foundation was laid out in meticulous detail. The deliberate defunding of local schools by influencing district boundaries, the coordination with banking partners to deny loans to Black-owned businesses in the area, and the strategic placement of undesirable facilities, like waste transfer stations, to depress property values. Most disturbing was his father's explicit racial animus. These people don't understand the value of what they're sitting on. Their businesses cater to their own kind, with no vision for what this area could become with the right ownership. Alexander felt physically ill, reading his father's words, recognizing the casual racism he'd been raised with and had unconsciously perpetuated through more sophisticated but equally destructive modern methods. His own company's current practices in Riverside, buying properties through shell companies, exploiting tenant vulnerabilities, manipulating zoning regulations, were simply updated versions of his father's tactics. The family legacy he'd been so proud to continue now appeared as something far darker. Nearby, a collection of Claire's personal items that he'd boxed away after her death sat largely untouched. On impulse, Alexander opened one, finding her music books and personal journals. Claire had been a classically trained pianist before becoming his wife, eventually abandoning her musical aspirations as she adapted to the social expectations of being married to a rising business star. Flipping through her performance programs, Alexander discovered something unexpected. Claire had frequently performed at community events in Riverside early in her career. The community center piano may be worn, but the acoustics in that old building are surprisingly perfect, she'd written in one journal entry. The audience there listens differently, not to judge technique, but to feel the music. The connection explained why Jasmine's playing had felt so hauntingly familiar. Her style and interpretation had been shaped by the same community musical tradition that had influenced Claire. The next morning, Alexander arranged an impromptu audition for Jasmine at the Berklee College of Music, using his connections to bypass normal procedures. Desiree had been hesitant but agreed when Alexander framed it as making amends for their restaurant encounter rather than charity. In Berklee's professional audition room, Jasmine approached the grand piano with quiet confidence, showing none of the nervousness one might expect from a 12-year-old in such settings. Her performance began with Bach's Prelude in C major, executed with technical precision, then transitioned into an improvisation that incorporated elements of jazz and gospel that reflected her community influences. The evaluators' expressions remained professionally neutral, but Alexander caught the subtle exchanges of glances that suggested they recognized exceptional talent. When the performance concluded, the lead evaluator, Dr. Harmon, offered measured praise. Very impressive technical foundation. The Bach was well executed, though perhaps lacking some of the emotional maturity that comes with more advanced training. Another evaluator nodded in agreement. The improvisation was interesting, though unconventional, with proper classical training to refine her approach. Alexander recognized the coded language. Jasmine's talent was undeniable, but her style and background were being subtly critiqued. Interesting, he interjected, surprising himself with his defensiveness. That improvisation incorporated counterpoint techniques that Bach himself would have recognized while simultaneously referencing jazz progressions developed by Thelonious Monk. What precisely needs refining about her approach? The evaluators seemed taken aback by his challenge, particularly coming from someone they'd assumed shared their perspective. Mr. Reed musical education, at this level, requires certain standardizations. Dr. Harmon explained carefully. Raw talent must be channeled appropriately. Alexander felt a growing indignation he wouldn't have recognized in himself a week earlier, channeled to sound like everyone else. That interesting improvisation demonstrated more original musical thinking than most conservatory graduates ever achieve. The confrontation left Alexander examining his own former biases. How many times had he dismissed people based on similar unstated criteria? How often had he used the same coded language in his business dealings that afternoon breaking? News alerts flashed across Alexander's phone. An investigative report had exposed Reed Enterprises' pattern of targeting historically black neighborhoods for gentrification projects nationwide. The detailed article included internal memos and emails, suggesting coordinated efforts to exploit vulnerable communities. Alexander immediately recognized Trevor's involvement. The specific document cited could only have come from someone with executive access. A call from his corporate communications director confirmed his suspicions. "The board is in emergency session," she explained. "Trevor's positioning this as your personal project gone rogue. He's telling them you've become emotionally compromised since Sophia's medical emergency." Social media was already exploding, with hashtags calling for boycotts of Reed Enterprise properties. Alexander's carefully cultivated public image had been replaced overnight with portrayal as a predatory developer exploiting vulnerable communities. Simultaneously, his interest in Jasmine was being characterized as a cynical PR maneuver. "Billionaires' Diversity Project." One headline blared suggesting he was using a talented black child as a shield against criticism. When Alexander attempted to contact Desiree, his call went straight to voicemail. Later that evening, Jasmine herself called from a friend's phone. "My mom says we can't accept any more help from you," she explained, her voice revealing her disappointment. "She says your company is the reason 27 families on our block got eviction notices, and working with you would be betraying them." The revelation that Desiree considered his efforts blood money hit Alexander harder than he'd expected. "Jasmine, I'm trying to change things," he attempted to explain. "The development plans the evictions. I'm working to stop them." "Mom says actions matter more than intentions," Jasmine replied with a wisdom beyond her years. "She says lots of people promise things when they need something, but real change comes from giving up power, not just using it differently." The line went dead, leaving Alexander with an uncomfortable truth. Despite his recent awakening, he was still approaching the situation with the assumption that his wealth and influence should determine outcomes. Meanwhile, Trevor was methodically building a case for Alexander's removal as CEO. "The board is concerned about your recent behavior," his attorney informed him during a late-night call. "Your cancellation of meetings, unilateral approaches to the Riverside community, and apparent emotional reaction to the medical incident with your daughter suggest you may not be in a position to make sound business decisions at this time." Alexander discovered that the Japanese investors had withdrawn completely following news of the controversy, citing concerns about instability in leadership. The public scrutiny intensified when previously buried documents about Reed Enterprises' discriminatory lending practices surfaced, threatening not just the company's reputation, but potentially triggering regulatory investigations. By morning, Reed Enterprises' stock had dropped 17%, and financial news networks were running constant coverage of what they termed the Reed implosion. Just when it seemed the situation couldn't deteriorate further, Sophia developed a high fever that sent Alexander racing back to the hospital. The pediatrician seemed concerned but uncertain about the cause. "We're running tests, but given her recent anaphylactic episode, we're being especially cautious." In desperation, Alexander called Desiree despite her previous rejection of contact. "Please," he said when she finally answered. "Sophia's sick again, and the doctors aren't sure what's happening. You recognized what was wrong before anyone else did." After a long pause, Desiree's voice softened slightly. "I'll come. But not for you, for your daughter." The Reed Enterprises boardroom had never felt so hostile to Alexander as it did that morning. After spending the night at the hospital where Desiree had correctly identified Sophia's secondary infection related to her allergic reaction, he'd come directly to face the board's emergency session. His appearance reflected his sleepless night, unshaven, wearing yesterday's wrinkled shirt beneath his suit jacket, dark circles underscoring his eyes. Before him lay the alternative development plan for Riverside that he'd created with help from community leaders, incorporating their vision while making it financially viable through innovative financing structures and phased implementation. This revised approach preserves existing housing while strategically upgrading infrastructure, Alexander explained, indicating architectural renderings on the presentation screen. The community land trust model allows residents to build equity while preventing displacement. Yes, our profit margins would decrease from 38% to approximately 14%, but 14% is unacceptable, interrupted Elaine Vaughn, the board's longest-serving member. Our fiduciary responsibility to shareholders requires maximizing returns, not subsidizing social experiments. The vote was swift and decisive. 8-1. With only Alexander opposing, the board removed him as CEO, citing actions contrary to company interests and erratic decision-making. Patricia Montgomery, previously CFO, was named interim chief executive, with Trevor Phillips promoted to chief operating officer. Your personal financial stake remains intact. For now, the corporate counsel informed Alexander as security waited to escort him from the building he'd entered as owner just hours earlier. However, any continued public statements against company interests could trigger a shareholder lawsuit for devaluation of stock. The financial implications were staggering. Without his position at Reed Enterprises, Alexander's liquid assets would sustain his current lifestyle for perhaps 6 months. His wealth was predominantly tied to company stock, which had already lost nearly 20% of its value since the controversy began. If the company proceeded with the original Riverside development against his public objections, he faced potential financial ruin. Nevertheless, Alexander's first action upon leaving corporate headquarters was to contact his personal attorney to file emergency injunctions against the eviction proceedings in Riverside, using his remaining personal resources to temporarily halt the process. The media landscape had become a battlefield of competing narratives. Conservative business channels portrayed Alexander as having a mental breakdown, abandoning sound business practices for emotional decision-making. The billionaire seems to be suffering from a classic case of white savior syndrome, one commentator suggested. Progressive outlets were equally skeptical, characterizing his apparent change of heart as too little too late, or a calculated move to rehabilitate his image after being caught in discriminatory practices. The racial dynamics of the situation colored every discussion, with commentators split on whether his actions represented genuine awakening or opportunistic exploitation of a black child's talent and a black community's struggle. Desiree faced her own challenges within Riverside. While many community members welcomed any ally in their fight against displacement, others viewed Alexander's involvement with deep suspicion. "He's still a Reed," argued Marcus Washington during a heated community meeting. "His family has been destroying black communities for generations. Why would we trust him now?" Desiree found herself in the uncomfortable position of defending the man whose company had issued her eviction notice. "People can change," she insisted, "and right now we need every resource we can get to save our homes." Meanwhile, Jasmine's musical opportunity at Berkeley had become complicated by the public controversy. The program director called Desiree privately. "We're very impressed with Jasmine's talent," he began carefully, "but we're concerned about the political situation surrounding Mr. Reed's involvement. If Jasmine were to accept our scholarship offer, we'd need assurance that her association with Mr. Reed wouldn't bring negative attention to the institution." The implication was clear. Jasmine could have the opportunity, but only if she distanced herself from Alexander and the Riverside controversy. Alexander's former associates weren't content to simply remove him from power. Trevor orchestrated a series of strategic leaks to business publications highlighting past comments Alexander had made in private about improving neighborhoods by upgrading resident profiles. While the statements had been common in real estate development circles, seeing them published in black and white revealed the implicit racism he'd previously failed to recognize in his own thinking. "You're facing a fundamental choice," explained Dr. Renee Johnson, a scholar in urban development whom Alexander had consulted about Riverside. "This isn't just about saving a neighborhood or helping one talented girl. It's about acknowledging systems of injustice that you've benefited from and perpetuated consciously or not." Alexander found himself contemplating not just the immediate crisis, but the multi-generational impact of his family's business practices. He discovered that the original Reed investment capital had come from his grandfather's insurance company, which had systematically undervalued black-owned properties and overcharged black policyholders. His father had leveraged those funds to acquire properties in red-line neighborhoods at depressed prices. Alexander's own innovations had merely modernized these predatory practices, using algorithms and financial engineering to achieve the same discriminatory outcomes under the guise of objective business decisions. Sophia's ongoing health challenges had created an unexpected connection between Alexander and Desiree. The specialized medical knowledge Desiree had acquired through her nursing studies and personal experience with Jasmine's allergies proved invaluable in managing Sophia's condition. During one late-night hospital vigil, Desiree had confided her own struggles. "Every system is designed to make it harder for people like me," she explained, while monitoring Sophia's breathing. "The healthcare system that bankrupted me when Jasmine had her first serious reaction. The education system that recognizes her talent but puts barriers in her way. The housing market that calls my home of 15 years underutilized property. We don't get the benefit of the doubt ever." Her words forced Alexander to recognize the invisible advantages that had shaped his life and business: the automatic credibility granted to his ideas, the assumption of competence, regardless of preparation, the access to resources, networks that remained closed to others, regardless of merit. In response to mounting financial pressure, Alexander began liquidating his personal assets: the vacation properties in Aspen and Martha's Vineyard, the art collection, the private aircraft. Each sale provided resources for the newly established Riverside Community Trust, designed to acquire properties and place them under community control. Legal challenges emerged from multiple directions. Reed Enterprises sued Alexander for breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of proprietary information. Community activists filed discrimination claims against the company. City officials caught between developer interests and community protests launched investigations into zoning irregularities. Historical records emerged, showing that portions of Riverside had originally been owned by freed slaves in the post-Civil War era, only to be seized through legally dubious tax foreclosures during the early 20th century. Amidst the chaos, Jasmine had created a musical composition titled Riverside Reflections that told the neighborhood's story through an innovative fusion of classical structure and jazz idioms. Her performance at a community fundraiser had attracted attention from music critics and gone viral online, creating new visibility for both her talent and the community's struggle. Alexander watched the video, repeatedly recognizing echoes of Claire's musical sensibilities in Jasmine's interpretation. The Boston Symphony Youth Competition offered Jasmine a prestigious performance opportunity, but with an unspoken condition. "We prefer our young artists to focus exclusively on their musical development," the director had explained to Desiree. "Political activism can be distracting at this stage of artistic growth." The message was clear. Jasmine could advance her career if she separated herself from the Riverside controversy and her association with Alexander. The final confrontation with Trevor occurred unexpectedly at Claire's grave, where Alexander had gone seeking some form of connection or guidance. Trevor appeared just as Alexander was placing fresh flowers beside the headstone. "I always thought your sentimentality was your weakness," Trevor remarked, maintaining a respectful distance. "Now it's destroying everything we built." Alexander stood slowly facing his former friend. "What we built was wrong, Trevor. My father's methods, my methods, all of it." Trevor's expression hardened. "Do you think any major fortune in this country has clean hands? Every empire is built on somebody's back. At least we did it legally." "Legally doesn't mean ethically," Alexander countered. and I can't keep pretending otherwise. You know, I've already begun approaching other neighborhoods similar to Riverside, right? Your little awakening won't stop the business model. The board's already approved expansion into 4 new markets with identical demographics. The casual revelation confirmed Alexander's worst fear, that stepping away had changed nothing in the system he'd helped create. Why are you telling me this? Trevor's smile was cold. Because I want you to know that your sacrifice meant nothing. The machine works with or without you. As Trevor turned to leave, he delivered a final shot. By the way, the board's considering legal action regarding your daughter. As a major shareholder, your decisions have damaged her future inheritance. We could petition for financial conservatorship on her behalf, given your apparent mental instability. The threat to Sophia crystallized Alexander's resolve. This wasn't just about Riverside anymore, or even about making amends for past wrongs. The systems he'd helped strengthen would continue consuming communities and lives unless confronted directly, and he now understood that his insider knowledge was perhaps the most valuable asset he could contribute to that fight. 1 year later, the renovated Riverside Community Center buzzed with anticipation as residents gathered for what had become an annual celebration of neighborhood resilience. Children darted between chairs being arranged for the evening's performances, while volunteers put finishing touches on display boards showing the community's transformation over the previous 12 months. Alexander Reed arrived without fanfare, noticeably different from the imposing figure who had first entered the center a year earlier. Gone were the designer suits and power accessories, replaced by casual business attire and a more relaxed demeanor. The most striking change was in his eyes, the calculating sharpness replaced by something warmer and more present. Beside him, 18-month-old Sophia toddled, energetically eager to explore her surroundings. Her excited squeal at spotting Desiree across the room brought smiles to both adults' faces. "Ta-da! Look, Miss Desi!" Sophia pointed, bouncing with excitement. The journey from that night at the Golden Palace to today had transformed all their lives in ways none could have predicted. Reed Enterprises had ultimately prevailed in the corporate battle, with Alexander losing control of the company his family had built over generations. However, his insider testimony to federal housing authorities had triggered investigations into discriminatory lending and development practices that extended far beyond his former company. The evidence he provided from his father's records and his own direct knowledge of industry practices had become central to landmark housing discrimination cases that were reshaping urban development nationwide. The Riverside Community Land Trust now owned 60% of the neighborhood's residential properties, protecting them from future speculation and displacement. Using innovative financing structures, Alexander had developed residents could build equity in their homes, while the land itself remained under community control. Alexander had found an unexpected second career as a consultant for ethical urban development, working with cities nationwide to implement community-centered approaches. His insider knowledge of how predatory development worked made him uniquely qualified to help communities defend against such practices. Desiree Wilson had completed her nursing degree and now led the Riverside Community Health Initiative, addressing the neighborhood's long-standing healthcare disparities. The program had become a model for community-based preventative care, focusing particularly on chronic conditions that disproportionately affected Black residents. Jasmine, now 13, had performed at Carnegie Hall 6 months earlier, becoming one of the youngest featured pianists in the venue's recent history. More importantly to her, she maintained deep connections to Riverside, returning each weekend to teach piano to neighborhood children in a program she had established with seed funding from the Community Trust. The Golden Palace restaurant had undergone its own transformation. After a discrimination lawsuit filed by former employees, including Desiree, revealed systematic racial disparities in pay and promotion, the restaurant had closed temporarily. It reopened under new management as a community-owned business that maintained the upscale dining experience while implementing profit sharing for workers and reserving 30% of positions for Riverside residents. Trevor Phillips and several former Reed Enterprises executives now faced federal charges for discriminatory business practices and securities violations revealed during the investigations. The evidence trail Alexander had provided proved crucial in connecting their actions to deliberate targeting of black neighborhoods for predatory development. Sophia's medical emergency had created an unexpected chosen family across racial and social lines. Desiree's expertise had proven invaluable during subsequent allergic incidents, and the women's initial wariness had gradually evolved into genuine friendship. As Jasmine set up her music on the community center's piano, the same instrument where Alexander had first heard her play, he reflected on his continuing journey. "I still catch myself making assumptions," he admitted to Desiree as they watched Jasmine arrange her sheet music. "Questioning people's competence or belonging based on appearance or background. The programming runs deep." Desiree nodded. "Recognizing it is the first step. Most people never get that far." The Riverside community still faced significant challenges. Gentrification pressure from surrounding areas continued, and many residents struggled economically despite the victories against displacement. But the collective power they'd built had created resilience and agency that extended beyond housing issues. Alexander observed a group of young musicians gathering around Jasmine, eager for her guidance before their performance. Her music program now served over 40 neighborhood children, creating opportunities previously unavailable within the community. The contrast between Jasmine now and the girl who had approached his table at the Golden Palace revealed her growth, still humble about her extraordinary talent, but increasingly confident in her ability to create change through her music and mentorship. "We saved 27 buildings on Washington Street," Desiree reported, referring to their most recent victory against a developer attempting to circumvent community protections. "The land trust model you helped establish held up in court." Alexander shook his head. "You saved those buildings. I just provided some tools." The evening's formal program began with a community choir performance followed by student presentations on Riverside's history. The highlight would be Jasmine's performance of an original composition commissioned by the Boston Symphony Orchestra, an unprecedented achievement for a musician her age. As Alexander took his seat in the audience, he found himself next to Mrs. Taylor, the elderly resident he'd first met in Desiree's apartment building. "You still working on making things right?" she asked directly, her gaze unwavering. Alexander nodded, trying to. "Every day." "Good," she replied simply. "That's all any of us can do." When Jasmine took her place at the piano, the room fell silent. She adjusted the microphone slightly before speaking. "This piece is dedicated to my mother, who taught me to never stop fighting for what matters, and to Claire Reed, whose musical legacy lives on through those she inspired in this community before her passing." Alexander felt an unexpected tightness in his throat at the mention of Claire, whose connection to Riverside he'd shared with Jasmine months earlier. The composition Jasmine played wove together classical structures with jazz improvisations and gospel harmonies, a musical representation of the community's diverse influences and resilient spirit. In the front row, Desiree wiped away tears of pride as her daughter's music filled the room. Later that evening, as the formal program concluded and people gathered in small groups, Alexander watched Sophia sitting beside Jasmine at the piano. The toddler pressed random keys with delight, while Jasmine patiently guided her tiny fingers, showing her how to play a simple melody. The image captured something essential about transformation. Not a single dramatic moment of change, but an ongoing process of teaching, learning, and growing across generations. The journey from that night at the Golden Palace had cost Alexander his company much of his fortune and his former identity. But watching Sophia and Jasmine together at the piano, he recognized that he'd gained something far more valuable: a genuine connection to community, a purpose beyond accumulation, and a chance to help build something that might begin to balance the scales his family had tilted for generations. What would you have done in Alexander's position? Would you have chosen to maintain your wealth and power, or risk everything to stand up for what's right? Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this story of transformation and redemption. If this story moved you or made you think differently about privilege and responsibility, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful, true stories about real human experiences. And don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear that change is always possible, no matter where you start from. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can become the most meaningful connections in our lives. The unexpected melody teaches us that true transformation begins when we recognize the invisible systems that shape our lives and others. Alexander's journey shows how privilege isn't just about wealth, but about moving through a world designed for your success. Real change requires not only acknowledging past wrongs, but actively working to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality. The story reminds us that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity doesn't. Jasmine's extraordinary abilities were nearly lost because systems designed to find merit actually filter for privilege and conformity. It shows how people can unknowingly perpetuate injustice while believing they're simply making sound business decisions. Perhaps most importantly, this story demonstrates that redemption isn't a single moment of realization, but an ongoing commitment to doing better. Alexander's transformation wasn't complete when he recognized the harm he caused. It began there. True change meant using his insider knowledge to help those fighting against the very systems he helped build. The unexpected connections between Alexander, Desiree, and Jasmine remind us that genuine relationships across social divides can be catalysts for change, but only when built on mutual respect rather than saviorism. Sometimes, saving someone else's community requires first understanding that it never needed saving at all, just protection from those who would destroy it for profit. What would you risk to stand up for what's right? Have you ever had a moment like Alexander's, where you suddenly saw your own role in systems larger than yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below about a time when your perspective was completely changed by someone unexpected in your life. If you believe in the power of human transformation and second chances, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. Subscribe to join our community of storytellers and listeners who believe in the power of narratives to change hearts and minds. And if you know someone struggling to find their moral compass in challenging situations, share this video as a reminder that it's never too late to choose a different path. Thank you for being part of our journey to explore the complicated realities of privilege, race, and redemption in America. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important melodies in our lives come from the most unexpected sources.